Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Adultified Children of Color, Intersections of Race and Age, an expert panel discussion co-hosted by Engage, Concordia's Center for Research on Aging, and the Black Perspective Office, also at Concordia, in honor of Black History Month. I'd like to begin this event first by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Gingangahaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. Colonialism confounds chronology, and as such, we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Although this talk is taking place on the unceded land of the Gingangahaka Nation, many of you are not watching from Montreal, so we invite you to reflect with us for a moment upon the lands and the histories where you find yourself today. Thank you, and thank you for your presence. We are very excited you are here with us today, and we look forward to the discussion with you. My name is Tristana Martin-Rubio, and I'm the coordinator of Engage, Concordia Center for Research on Aging, one of the sponsors of this event. I'm very pleased to be joined on the floor by Anik Morgan-Flavin, founding coordinator of the Black Perspectives Office and a co-chair of the President's Task Force on Anti-Black Racism at Concordia University, who will now say a few words.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all. As Tristana said, I am the founding coordinator for the Black Perspectives Office. I'm also a co-chair on the Task Force for Anti-Black Racism at Concordia University, multiple graduate of this university, and I know this space quite well. This office, the Black Perspectives Office, is a new office since September of 2020. And a lot of the work that we do is around resourcing, supporting, connecting, and advocating for Black communities, perspectives, initiatives, and scholarship at Concordia University. The office is informed by and stands in solidarity with Black lives, of course. And we serve directly Black students, staff, and faculty at Concordia, but we also create entry pathways for the larger Black communities around the world, and of course, the local context of Montreal. So thank you so much for being here and taking this moment to engage with realities that affect Black communities, as well as other communities of color, and engaging in this conversation.
Thank you so much. And thanks to your office for supporting this event. So a few announcements before we begin, just about logistics. First, you need to know this talk is being recorded and the video will be archived on the Engage YouTube channel. The recording will only include footage of the panelists speaking, and any questions posed by the audience, to the panelists by the audience will be anonymous unless you explicitly state to have your name indicated with your, included with your question. Second, we invite you and encourage you to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions or comments you might have to the panelists. We are not opening up the floor to questions using the panel bar. However, we encourage you at any time in the event to just post the questions that you do have in either one of the question and answer box or in the chat. And you can do so at any point in the course of the presentations or in the course of the discussion period. We also encourage you to use social media beyond this Zoom webinar, so you can follow us on Twitter at engage_CU. A note very quickly about how the event will proceed. I will briefly introduce the panel topic, which will be followed by panelist presentations. We'll start with Dr. Kisha McPherson and then proceed to Dr. Yasmin Jiwani. Each presenter will speak on their work for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience, as well as a sort of conversational style of discussion. So this panel explores the phenomenon of adultification bias. Very briefly, adultification bias names a special form of racial prejudice in which children of color are seen to be older than they in fact are, and more adult-like than white children of the same age. That is, as less innocent, as less needing nurturing, less comforting, less protection, and so on. And to explore the social phenomenon, we are fortunate to have here with us two scholars on this issue, Dr. Kisha McPherson and Dr. Yasmin Jiwani. And I want to thank you both for joining us today. We will start with Dr. Kisha McPherson. It's my pleasure to introduce you. Dr. Kisha McPherson is an educator and scholar with over 15 years of experience and holds a faculty position at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Education. Dr. McPherson's research and scholarship is focused on the impact of policy, media, and contemporary representations of Blackness on the identity and education of Black girls, and is interested in using Black feminist approaches to developing anti-oppressive pedagogies to support teaching and learning in both formal, academic, and community spaces. Please welcome to the virtual floor, Dr. Kisha McPherson. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me as part of this panel. And so again, thank you for that introduction. And similar to Julia Henderson, and I'm just sort of looking at the note there, I too am coming to you or speaking to you from the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Musqueam people on campus at University of British Columbia. So I am so very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you from these lands and sort of recognizing the people who have been here and always have been here as the holders and the keepers of this lands that we are on. And so talking about adultification today, I am also sort of acknowledging my immigrant status and position as a child of Jamaican immigrants to Canada. And that also sort of plays into this whole conversation around adultification and sort of the cultures and the communities that are affected by this bias and this phenomenon that we are hearing more about, sort of discussed in scholarship. And if you would allow me to, I'm going to share my screen here because I have prepared a few slides in the presentation to sort of talk about this issue in a little bit more detail. Here we go. Let me just go to the main presentation screen. Okay. Oh, sorry. Stop share. Oh, sorry about that. I hit the wrong. I hit the wrong box. Just bear with me here 1 second. It's still doing it. Excuse me for 1 second. I'm not quite sure. This was working a second ago. And now I had another presentation up there. Okay, this should work now. Yes, thank you. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. So I'm talking about Black children and the adultification bias. And so first, just explaining what adultification bias is, and the introduction also provided some context to this, but adultification bias refers to the tendency that adults have to perceive Black children as older as they are. And we're talking about children of color here, but I'm going to be focused specifically on some impacts that as it relates to Black children's experiences. And so just sort of being mindful and open to sort of understanding how these concepts also impact people in other communities, but being specific here around the experience that has been identified in research for Black children. So this is when Black children's actions and behaviors are void of any innocence that is often associated with with childhood and protects non-Black children. So as any unwanted behavior from Black children is then seen as malicious and willful, whereas in behavior from children in other, for white children specifically, can be seen as innocent and sort of packaged as part of this experience or the developmental stage of childhood. So what happens with adultification is that Black boys and Black girls, it manifests in different ways. And so I've outlined some of the major concerns here around racism, classism, ableism, and sexism, and I'll get back to them towards the end of this brief introduction here on this concept. So for the adultification of Black boys, what happens is that it leads to more disproportionate punitive measures that result from any type of behavior or infraction that is seen as undesirable. So some of the research that has been conducted on the phenomenon has identified, for example, that Black boys continue to be suspended and expelled at a much higher rate than any other group. Again, thinking about that behavior, those unwanted infractions that might take place in an education setting, for example, and how the measures that are, put in place in order to address those issues tend to be more disproportionately punitive for Black boys and Black girls. We're seeing that in terms of the increasing number of Black girls that are also affected by the punitive measures that are placed onto them for these types of infractions within school spaces. So we also hear that Black boys suffer from what is commonly referred to, and you've probably heard of, this school to prison pipeline, whereas we're taking the behaviors or sort of the infractions that Black children might have conducted in school, and that ultimately leads to higher incarceration rates or leads to criminal interaction with authorities in a way that they become criminally more culpable for things that they do that are often considered just childhood behavior. So we've heard terms like, boys will be boys, or they're just children, and so forth. What adultification bias teaches us is that, or shows us in terms of, being able to name the phenomenon, is that these types of understanding or general notions of innocence in childhood is not afforded to Black children. And so this is something that we see. Now for Black girls, again, as I was saying, this is adultification biases of Black children. It impacts both Black boys and Black girls. Now what we see is the differences in reference to the compounding marginality that Black girls might face in reference to their intersectionality. And as a result of that, we'll see some of those concerns a little bit more highlighted in the experiences of Black girls. So the adultification of Black girls prevents them from experiencing childhood or the childhood stages that are often and commonly associated with innocence for white children, again, similar to Black boys. What also happens there in reference to girls, it's looking at the intersectionality, as I just mentioned, is that they're dealing with adultification bias on top of other issues that they would have to deal with in relation to gender. So for example, thinking about sexual assault and objectification also becomes tied into this concept in terms of how it impacts and affects Black girls. So for example, Black girls as young as 5 years old bear the burden of stereotypes that are applied to Black women. So if we think about some of those stereotypes that we're consistently seeing in the media or played out in the media for media tropes, what happens is that for Black children, these stereotypes are also associated to their being and their bodies in a way that creates further tensions and concerns with the overall phenomenon of adultification. So what we do know is that Black children face harsher, more punitive punishment. So we see that higher rates of suspension and expulsions is common within school systems that are supposed to be educating Black children. Black children lack innocence, resulting in the less need for protection, nurturing, and support, kind of what I was mentioning at the introduction. So for Black girls, considering those multiple and compounding oppressive factors in reference to the identities that they carry, Black girls are often seen as more independent and are consistently viewed by adults as having to know better. So for example, any type of activities that they engage in that would be considered just childhood behavior for other groups are then sort of denied to that for Black girls in terms of them having to know better. So then there's a disproportionality, not only with school discipline, but in terms of how law enforcement or either other people in authority exercises that authority when dealing with Black children. So that becomes part of the concerns as well. So coming back to these adultification factors, which I talked about earlier in reference to what are the factors of oppression that are implicated in adultification bias. So racism is one that's clear. So this panel here is talking about the adultification of children of color. So we're talking about racism, broad in terms of how it affects different groups of color, different groups of children, based on their association in terms of background and ethnicity and so forth. And so what happens is that we see that it happens to children of color more specifically, which of course is an indicator of racism. And because of those associated stereotypes that follow Black experiences in Black life, particularly that of adults, are then projected onto the children. And therefore they lose out on that period of that developmental stage of childhood because of how they are seen within our society. Sexism for Black girls specifically, or just looking at in terms of identification, gender, and the spectrum of identification, there's sexism that might be implicated in a number of different ways. But because of the effect of adultification bias on Black girls specifically, we know that sexism is also one of those forms of oppression that is tangled up within this phenomenon as well. And because of intersectionality in terms of the compounding factors of marginality that Black girls might be experiencing in reference to their identities, this then continues to sort of conflate the issues into a larger concern. Classism, because we tend to see this with low income or sort of immigrant families specifically coming into the country, maybe just establishing and getting set up, which I do believe that we'll talk about a little bit more. But what we do see is that it's a socialized adultification that tends to happen to Black children that place them in positions that require them to be more adult-like just for means of survival, which again initiates or sort of indicates classism as a feature there. Now, another area that I think I'm more interested in sort of talking about it is in reference to ableism. And I'm not talking about some of the ableism in terms of disability and how we sort of think about disability as a field, but we're thinking specifically about hyperability and how Black children are then considered to be hyper able as children to then act in adult-like ways. And so this exaggerates, of course, in terms of their position and their ability, their developmental stage in which they can then be able to make decisions. There's a hyperability that is placed on Black children that, of course, unfairly indicates or prevents them from being able to apply some of those notions of childhood to their experiences and so forth. So when I'm thinking about Black children, I'm thinking about a number of different areas of adultification bias, or sort of the factors that play into adultification bias in reference to how we understand oppression and marginalities within our society. And I'm also thinking specifically about the compounding ways in which it impacts Black girls, specifically, not just with the sort of school to prison pipeline, which is something that is impacting Black girls on a higher rate, continues to grow in reference to the amount of Black girls that are now becoming in conflict with the law and how that sort of impacts their experience. But then sort of thinking a little bit about the sexual objectification as well that is compounded on top of that. So when we talk about the manifestation for Black children, these are the different ways that they could show up and create barriers in their lives. And so these are some of the references here. And then there's also a lot of information that's, emerging online about adultification. So there's a number of different articles that have been written in the media that have also described the phenomenon. So just sort of looking at some titles there as well. And so I will stop sharing now. As we continue. So that pretty much is the presentation. And I do know that in terms of the follow-up, we'll have more time to discuss some of these points later on.
Thank you so much, Dr. McPherson. Our next speaker is Dr. Yasmin Jiwani from Concordia University. Dr. Jiwani is a full professor in the Department of Communication Studies and a Concordia University Research Chair on intersectionality, violence, and resistance. Her research interests focus on the discursive ways in which racist sexism is conceptualized and ideologically utilized in popular discourse. The particular sites which she has examined include media reportage of violence against Indigenous and racialized immigrant women, representations of Indigenous and Muslim youth in the popular press, as well as discourses of resistance articulated by marginalized groups in film and other popular media. Her most recent project is centered on cyber memorials and virtual graveyards as reflections of the vernacular. Here, her analysis attends to race, gender, and belonging as expressed in the narratives posted on these sites. She's the author of Discourses of Denial, Race, Gender, and Violence, and co-editor of Girlhood, Redefining the Limits and Faces of Violence in the Lives of Girls. Please welcome Dr. Jiwani to the virtual floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tristana, and thank you so much, Kisha, for setting the stage, basically, for me. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous nations. I am actually speaking to this panel from Algonquin territory and the Anishinaabe peoples. And I want to start out by saying that you know, the whole construction of childhood is very much framed in terms of where we're located. That's part of it. So in the Western tradition, childhood was constructed at a particular point in time and then deconstructed and then reconstructed again in terms of consumer culture. So the framing of childhood is really something that we need to take into account. The second thing is the whole idea of adultification, because I think adultification really depends on the kinds of violences that are enacted on children and youth growing up, depending on their status. So if you're in a minoritized community here, for instance, then the kinds of pressures that are going to be enacted on you as a child growing up or a young adult are very different than if you're in a country where you are part of the majority. So the majority minority distinction, I think, needs to be really sort of outlined there. The third thing that I want to say is that with adultification, I think and this is what the literature also suggests, it's a matter of liabilities and assets. On the one hand, the liabilities that are exacted from individuals who are being adultified in this way. And I want to bring this back to the whole notion of intersectionality and how it plays out. So I'm going to go straight into some of the sort of like examples that I've encountered along my research that speak to that kind of adultification. One is the issue of what's called crimmigration, which is how or when practices, policies, and laws around immigration intersect with criminalization of youth. And this is something that Kisha mentioned. So there's a very good example in Canadian history, recent Canadian history of that, when we think about the Omar Khadr case, because Omar Khadr was a child soldier and he was apprehended and then imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay. He was a Canadian, but the Canadian government refused to bring him back until there was considerable advocacy and legal intervention on the part of the communities here and his own lawyers in order to be able to extract him out of Guantanamo and then get him out of the US because he was in prison in the US. So 15-year-old Omar Khadr was considered to be an adult as opposed to a child, even though technically, legally, and according to international law, he was actually identified as a child soldier and hence not regarded as being responsible for his actions. And yet the state defined him as such. So this is where criminal law and immigration practices come together in terms of how they adultify children. My second point is where these intersections come together. So looking at representations of Somali youth, for instance, who are both Black and Muslim. So what does this mean when the war on terror and the discourses around terror come together with discourses around Black criminality? How do they engage and actually shape the lives of these young people? And how do they then make them more accountable? So young Somali youth who may be involved or are caught engaging in the drug trade, for instance, as a way to counter the kind of poverty they're inflicted with. How are they then treated by the justice system? Not as youth, but rather as adults. So that kind of adultification comes into the point. And the third example I have is around Indigenous young women and how, in fact, the trafficking of young Indigenous women is contingent on their adultification and the kind of stereotypes that persist in Canadian history, but also in Western history about Indigenous women. And this speaks in a way to what Kisha had raised before around Black women and how Black girls and how, in fact, these stereotypes are foisted on them from the time they're very young. So in bringing it back all to adultification, I want to sort of go back to something that Linda Burton has talked about, which is the idea of the different kinds of adultification that prevail. There is a pre-conscious or precautious adultification, a mentorial adultification, purification, and then parentification. I want to place those all within the context of immigrant youth, because this is where they play out in a big way. particularly in terms of these young people's encounters with systems and social services that are designed to help them, but that often fail them in the process. So when we think about the preconscious adultification, it's where these young people or children are exposed to adult concerns that they really can't handle and that they shouldn't be exposed to because it mars their experiences of childhood. Think of children that have to listen to parents arguing about economic issues, about financial stresses and so forth. This is that kind of exposure, the growing up really quickly, but growing up really quickly without having a choice and without being mentored in that process. The mentorial or the mentored kind of adultification is where, you know, you think about a woman or a mother who doesn't have money and who's really sick and has to rely on her child in order to be able to intercede for her, manage the household and so forth. And that's another kind of adultification. The third kind is purification, where the mother or the parents actually treat the child as if that child is on the same level, is a peer, and hence has to share all of the concerns, stresses, and so forth. And the fourth kind is where the child actually becomes a parent. And you see this especially for children whose parents have chronic illnesses, for instance, or who are alcoholics, where the child pretty much takes on that parental role. So when we think about immigrant youth and refugee youth, this very much is compounded by the fact that these youth and children often have to assume a whole burden of communication. They have to be the links between the parents or the family unit and the society. They have to translate everything. They have to be the ones that are sort of like advocating for those parents. They have to take on the burdens of the financial issues by working very early and so forth, or even worrying about it. And so poverty, immigration status, the kinds of stereotypes that are around, the minoritized positioning of that community really comes into the fore. Its class the class element comes in. So all of these things come together to compound a situation of multiple kinds of marginalities that are interwoven in the daily lives of these young people. So that's the other part of it that I think that we have to look at. Now, when I think about it in terms of the issue of liabilities, all of these become liabilities along the way. When a child has to grow up too quickly, assume all of these kinds of things, and has to mature really fast, there is no element of childhood left. The play that's there, the creativity and so forth. But also, what does it mean for that child growing up when they have to become parents at a very young age? How does that factor in? And if they're the sole people interacting, where they know the normative values of society, know how to navigate that, but the parents don't, what kind of power relations are then sort of played out in that family? And how are the parents themselves infantilized in that process? So there's a whole interactional dynamic that goes on, you know, where this kind of sort of like the relations of power, the hierarchies that are normally there are turned upside down. I think that has a major impact, not only on the children growing up, but also on the parents in terms of how powerless they feel being isolated in a society where they're subject to racism, classism, religious phobias, and so forth. So that kind of distancing is really accentuated in that process. And that helplessness, that powerlessness really, I think, contributes not only to the kind of mental health issues that are there in the family, but also its very survivability in the dominant society. But the other thing is that there's a part of it that we often don't realize, which are the assets. And I think this is something that we also need to look at. Yes, the children become more resilient in the process, but the assets are the assets that also allow them to survive in a racist society. This is not easy. And when they take on the skills that they acquire in that growing up process, if those processes are away from crimmigration and the criminalization of race, then in some ways it does equip them with more assets to be able to survive and thrive. But again, this is a matter of what is their location and what are the protections that are afforded in terms of class protections, in terms of status, in terms of the social and cultural capital that they come in with. So for instance, if you're immigrating from a previously colonized English-speaking country and you come into an English-speaking settler territory, you have a certain kind of cultural capital. Whereas if you come in from an English-speaking colonized country and you come into a territory, a settler country that is French-speaking, you're going to be challenged in a different way. And so there are all of these sort of multiple considerations that I think we have to take into account. And the final thing that I want to say is that in framing adultification, one of the definitions that I really like is one that Linda Burton talks about, because she says, adultification comprises of contextual, social, and developmental processes in which youth are prematurely and often inappropriately exposed to adult knowledge and assume extensive adult roles and responsibilities within family networks. So it's this idea of the contextual, the social, and the developmental that I think needs to be underscored. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jiwani. So we will now open the floor to questions from the audience and discussion among the panelists. And I'm very pleased to present Josie Fome, who will be moderating this period. Josie Fome is journalist and host of Filling the Void with Josie podcast. She's a multimedia freelance journalist with a keen interest on issues related to the African continent and the African diaspora. She has international experience in community facilitation, radio show production, and documentary filmmaking. Her ideal assignments marry storytelling and accountability. She has a passion for reshaping and creating new narratives surrounding the African continent and the African diaspora through storytelling in all of its forms. She received her Bachelor's of Arts in Communication Studies from Concordia University in 2017 and a graduate diploma in journalism also from Concordia in 2018. Josie was the recipient of the CJAD 800 Gord St. Clair Radio Award in 2017 and the Susan Carson Memorial Bursary in 2018. She's currently the blog coordinator and head editor of Saya Diaspora, a platform for young African women worldwide, and is the podcast host for Filling the Void with Josie, a podcast for lifelong learners who may or may not believe university was a scam. Josie is currently based in Montreal, Canada. Thank you, Josie. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tristana. Thank you, Dr. Jiwani, Dr. McPherson. Those were phenomenal presentations. As we wait for questions to kind of come in for the audience, like you mentioned, we really want this to be a conversation. So I kind of want to give you the floor to respond to each other's presentations. Kisha, we'll start with you to respond to what you heard and kind of what you took away from Dr. Jiwani's presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that opportunity. Yeah, the presentation was absolutely directly along the lines of some of the things that I've been thinking about, or what we've been thinking about in reference to adultification. And this kind of brings up some of the tensions that I started to talk to you about, Yasmin, in reference to how do we think about adultification in a way that sort of allows us to focus on how it is oppressive and limiting, but then still seeing it as something that also functions as, you know, a cultural necessity in some sense, especially for immigrant families that are coming into this space. And I think that that's the difficulty when we're trying to sort of think about the systems, as you've mentioned, like the systemic ways in which adultification then creates barriers for children of color, but then also looking at the cultural ways which it's necessary for maintaining and continuing to sort of, you know, help. And I think with what your presentation, some of the points that you've pulled out there really sort of creates that sort of dichotomy that we have to think about. It's not just an easy, simple explanation to say that this is something that is happening and it affects children of color, but it's also something that we have to think about a little bit more thoroughly and think through in reference to how that also supports the ongoing survival of different communities as they enter different spaces and try to, live in the diaspora. So that's one of the things that sort of came out for me. So thank you so much for that. Even some of the other terms that I, thinking about the peer, that was really interesting because that is a function that I see of Western parenting and childhood, that again, sometimes communities that are othered or marginalized seek to emulate or adapt because we're thinking of it as the best method of parenting, which also is very problematic in reference to how we then, create these mini adults in situations where they're supposed to be parented, and parenting is supposed to be what's taking place. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McPherson. Dr. Jiwani, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about this sort of the assets and liabilities issues, because I think, when I think back as an immigrant girl, and I think back to growing up in Uganda, we had childhood because there was a sort of defined time where you could play, you could be mischievous, you could do all kinds of things, and you weren't held responsible and accountable to the same degree. But this is where the majority minority distinction, I think, is really, really important, because we often forget that in many parts of the world, by the time you are 12, you're considered a young adult. Many religious formations actually regard that age, 12, as being the sort of like demarcation. When you think about, like, for instance, even circumcision is supposed to be done around by a certain age. So these sort of like in a way, the age becomes arbitrary depending on where you are. But I think it's the minoritization of a community that really creates a kind of pathological issue around adultification. And it's that pathology that we need to look at, which is what is the impact on the child growing up that suddenly has to assume a level of responsibility and accountability for her or his parents that way exceeds what they are able to do. So I think that weight, that burden, and this is where I think service providers really need to look at the world a little differently. And when they look at children coming in, who say, for instance, skip school or want to run away and stuff like that, what is it that they're running away from? It's not simply a matter of a cultural clash, because this is how it's all often explained away, but it's like, what are the elements there which are forcing or contorting that child's psyche to fit a certain dominant pattern, that is creating this kind of sort of, I'm thinking here of the young women, the Shafia case, where the young women were, the whole sort of murdered, and the murders were considered to be part of, they were considered to be honor crimes, right? Honor killings. When in fact, and the whole thing was like how these girls would go to school, and they would go to school wearing their hijabs, but then at school they would quickly change and become westernized. So, the argument was, oh my God, like, what's happening to these girls? But rather than, like, look at the strength of these girls, that they were able to evade a whole system and then go in there and then act out the way they wanted to act out, their own sort of processes of resistance. So why were those processes of resistance necessary in the first place? Why wasn't the environment in the school such that it would embrace all kinds of differences? So I think it's like how we even begin. And this minority majority thing has really struck me, particularly in terms of not only migrating, my own sort of history of migration from Africa to England, England to Canada, and within Canada from a British settler area like British Columbia to Quebec. So how does that all factor in terms of where am I positioned as a brown Muslim woman, right? In this context where I'm dealing with the war on terror, but I'm also dealing with the whole exotification that comes with sort of like the Indian element in Quebec, as opposed to its criminalization and pathologization in the West.
That's so true. I have a similar story or experience, I can say, having been born in Cameroon and then having to immigrate with my family to the United States, and growing up in a context where it's like your parent is constantly telling you, you're here, you're in this new culture, but I don't want you to accept anything from this culture. And so you have these dual identities and you are completely broken and you don't know how to navigate that. And you're in a place where there aren't others who have been through that particularly. So you don't really know who you can speak with or who you can speak to. And so you're looking for people who understand, and you end up just turning inwards because nobody really, you conclude that nobody really understands that. I don't know. What do you think, Dr. McPherson?
Thank you for that, Josie. And just even sort of thinking a little bit about what Yasmin was saying and the intersectionality that plays in, which is kind of what you're describing there in terms of the compounding factors that would require, like, why is it that, you know, families when they immigrate to Canada, for example, feel so strongly about keeping their culture intact? You know, so there's these conversations that we don't necessarily like have in reference to the agency and the ownership that people are really seeking to hold on to, especially as they start to disperse throughout the diaspora. And why I'm bringing up intersectionality here is because what you've described and what we've been talking about, especially as Yasmin talks about missing and murdered Indigenous women, is how we don't sort of, our society is not designed, and perhaps this is on purpose, in order to look at those compounding factors in reference to how we go about treating and sort of dealing with situations as they arise. And so as Yasmin talks about social service workers, as an educator that's like in the field of education, I'm thinking about teachers, and I'm thinking about how adultification in reference to what we're expecting specific children to be able to do and how we treat them in circumstances and situations that are undesired, for example, then becomes such a huge piece, because it's like we have a space where all of these people immigrants are invited. We're invited, like, let's be clear to that Canada invites in a sense, even going out to different parts across the world, recruiting immigrants to come into this, but not preparing to take an intersectional approach to how we not only deal with the families, like the parents, but also the children that are coming in and settling into this space, and the ways in which culture needs to be, because of what is taken from a Western perspective in reference to the colonial history that has pretty much touched every part of the globe, why it's so important for us to hold on to culture and to sort of raise our children within a space that allows us then to continue that on. But I think the larger issue too is what I was saying in reference to coming into Canadian systems. How do we deal with it, or the adultification that takes place from a systemic level? So it's one thing if that is happening in my home, from the family structure because of the needs of the family surviving in the system. But then the system itself is also creating and maintaining those systemic barriers that makes adultification something that we need to be concerned of in reference to how it prevents children of color from accessing the services that they should be able to access, and from preventing children then from being treated fairly within the system. So speaking specifically about education, you know, thinking about the punitive measures, about suspending and all of this other stuff. So we have systemic systems that are then taking on or pulling from, you know, this notion of adult-like people, children, in a way that is very unfair when it's compared to other groups of children, white children specifically, in terms of what is accepted and what is expected in their development and childhood.
If I can just add to that, that's so true. And I think for me, you know, one of the issues is that we can't separate the child from the family. It's like a unit, right? Just like the family is part of a community. So it's like what happens inside the family. So a lot of the sort of ethnographic work has actually talked about this in terms of, you know, poor families, families that are refugees and so forth. But if the power imbalance within the family shifts like that, where the kids can then turn around and then sort of like power over the parents, how does that make the parents feel? And how does that generate a particularly bad climate within that family? So in terms of mental health issues, you see this particularly with parents who have substance abuse issues, and the kids have to take on that kind of sort of parental role and often end up being quite abusive to the parents. And then there are kids who will actually run away from the burden of it all because it's too much. So I think, that is kind of what concerns me, is that in the minoritizing, in the process of racialization, the families turn inwards to try and protect themselves, to try and have, in fact, the whole notion of, I don't want you to be assimilated outside. I want you to maintain a sense of our culture. Part of it is like maintaining that identity, right? It's like, it becomes sort of the only cultural capital one has. So it's hanging on to it in the face of the violence of racism that is constantly bearing down, and that is stripping one of agency, but also this sense of empowerment. So in that situation, a lot of these parents are sort of like hanging on to these kids as if they're like the only thing they can hang on to. And the kids are themselves feeling so pressured because they have to navigate the outside world and they have to intercede. And it's that, Anik, Josie, it's what you were saying about feeling that sort of double-edged, that marginalization coming from both sides. Is incredibly difficult on the child, but also incredibly difficult on the parents that feel like they're losing control.
That's so true. Speaking of context and just the different sectors where we see this come into reality, there's a question coming in from Claudia Barnett. I hope I got your name correct. Sorry, Claudia. For Dr. McPherson, who, first of all, thanks you for your lovely presentation, but then asks, could you speak to the impact of adultification bias in the context of healthcare systems and children's hospitals? We know healthcare is huge in terms of how they treat people of color, marginalized people. She continues, thinking about links between calls to the CAS and other insidious acts of anti-Black racism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for that question. And thank you, Josie, for reiterating that question as well. So this is interesting too, because I've been thinking a lot about that healthcare system and anti-Black racism as it relates to healthcare and how Black people are treated within these particular systemic or structures. And that's one of the areas that I think is really interesting, because we can actually say, like, based on the disparities that we can see in healthcare, that children of Black people are experiencing racism before they even enter the world, right? And so because they are actually, like, for example, think of the Black woman who is pregnant with a child and experiencing racism at the hands of those healthcare providers, for example, then that is obviously carried over to the child that she is about to have. And so for Black people, thinking about anti-Black racism and the healthcare and how this sort of fits in there, we could for sure say and sort of clearly say that racism is something that Black children experience before they even actually enter the world. And so to answer your question there, I think that it's something that continues to come up as it relates to healthcare because of how Black people are treated, in reference to the disparities that we have so many statistics that point to. Even now with COVID-19, we're looking at communities that are highly impacted by COVID-19 because of the neglect around other social determinants of health that then force Black communities into specific situations that, of course, has a negative impact on overall general health that is important for maintaining or sort of even being able to care for yourself if you were to contract the virus. And so I think that the adultification is something that we see playing out. But I think what's most interesting about your question is talking specifically about CAS, because this is another structure and a system that we've talked about too in terms of the systemic approaches. So what I get most concerned of in terms of adultification of Black children are systemic responses to racism, to anti-Black racism, or to, in terms of how we respond to these situations for groups of people, communities of people that we are inviting into this country, and that we are basically saying, okay, here is a free access to these like education, healthcare, all of these different things, but we have not provided or accommodated for different communities by thinking about intersectionality and other accommodations that we need to make to ensure that we are properly preparing for these communities. And so CAS is one of those structures that continually gets implicated in reference to how they deal with childcare issues of Black and Indigenous youth specifically, or children specifically, because they are then putting a lot of these adultification factors that we've both discussed onto these families and into the lives of these young people without, of course, adequately creating systems or structures that are supporting families throughout these transitions. So for example, with CAS, when we have these differences, and Yasmin sort of talked about it too, in terms of the cultural differences of childhood that exist across the world, and coming into a space like Canada where you're melding all of this together, CAS, for example, has been cited for not being culturally appropriate or being able to accommodate for families that would be experiencing adultification in various different ways for various different reasons, and then continue to make adultification and the bias around Black children with adultification an issue based on their response to these issues, and based on how they continue to place children of color in care for specific reasons that, again, are not, they're not sort of, they don't have the tools or the skills, I don't know what it is, but they have not adequately accommodated for those cultural differences, which needs to be a part of the process. So to answer your question, Claudia, yes, it continues to be, adultification continues to be like a concern within healthcare for those reasons around racism happening and how the disproportionate impact of lack of care leads to people of color, especially immigrant families coming into this country. And then also thinking about institutions like CAS and how their responsibility is to childhood, but then they're not taking into consideration and accommodating for these different phenomenons that we experience that of course impacts how families take care of their children. And as Yasmin correctly pointed out, you can't separate the children from the family. These are some of the things that we have to consider overall. Thank you again for an opportunity to respond to that question.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question for that. But before I do, I'll pose this question asked by Said Bukhari. And their question is regarding how the framing and treatment received by the second generation children is perceived and internalized. Can we say that the system reproduces the ideology and the children of people of color, especially the second generation, as become a part of it, reproducing the same notion? That could be to either one of you.
I'm not exactly clear on the question. Can you say it again?
How the framing and treatment received by the second generation children is perceived and internalized. I think that is the main question. And then they continued to propose, can we say that the system reproduces the ideology and the children of people of color, especially for second generation children who become a part of it, thus reproducing the same notion? I'm assuming the notion would be whatever was initially perceived and internalized.
So if I can just quickly come in and sort of and respond. So this is something that comes up a lot in my research, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, and please let me know if I'm not. So thinking a little bit about how second generation or third generation children might take up or internalize some of what those narratives around children of color or people of color might be experiencing, and how that then goes to reproduce it. And I think it comes up a lot in my research, or it comes up, I shouldn't say a lot, it's come up in my research because I was comparing first generation responses to Blackness to like second and third generation. So for example, people that grew up I was born and raised in Toronto, Jamaican parents, as I said, so immigrant parents. I consider myself to be second generation just because my parents were naturalized as Canadian citizens. And so I'm thinking of it that way. But I know that term sometimes gets misused in reference to which generation you are. But let's just say I was born here, my parents are Jamaican. And one of the things that I found is that if I talk to members of my community growing up with me, even like cousins and so forth, very few of us actually liked being Black growing up. because of the negative associations with Blackness, because of the anti-Black racism, that we didn't have the ability to sort of name or describe. And as a result of that, we didn't like our own identity. Like, so as you were saying, reproducing those same notions is exactly what happened to a lot of us that came in and were born in Canada, for example, but then see all of these negative associations with Blackness and want to distance ourselves from it as much as possible. And that's distancing ourselves from our family again, and sort of then creating those tensions around, what do I associate with? Am I a Canadian? Am I taking on Canadian cultures and values, or am I staying true with my family, and so forth? Now, what I found difference, which is whenever anybody says to me, what's hopeful in the research, is the fact that when I asked that of second and third generation Black girls, they were all happy to be Black. They were all proud of their Black heritage and their identity. They were proud of, so I think that, to answer your question, is that we're seeing sort of like what some first generation or second generation people might have experienced in terms of that negative association with Blackness. We're seeing that change in young people today. So they're not necessary. So they recognize the injustice of the system as the problem and not their Blackness, which is what the difference is, which to me is like fascinating and just exactly what we would hope to happen in reference to our development and our decolonizing and sort of understanding our own individual process of coming to terms with what colonialism and the legacies of colonialism in Canada actually creates within immigrants and settlers. So that is, you know, a positive outcome that I could say, is that there is a definite change. When I talk to people that I grew up with, there was that negative association with Blackness that we were actually able to, over time, and because we are more vocal about some of these systemic injustices and we're able to talk about racism openly, and school boards across the, you know, the province or across the country have all of these equity and diversity, I think what it's teaching Black children is that all of what we experience in reference to racism shouldn't be this way, and that these systems have to do something to change it. They know that it's not automatic, and they know for the most part it doesn't always work, but then they do see it as a responsibility of the system, whereas in before, I don't know. I didn't do a formal research study on this. This is what I would observe just through my data collection.
In terms of the changes that you're noticing, would you say that those changes are happening for Black children who are predominantly surrounded by other Black people? Or is it also happening in spaces where it's Black children or children of color who are predominantly surrounded by white people and white cultures?
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, Josie, and thank you so much for bringing that up, because I don't want to say that it's a general sort of shift, because these are girls that are growing up in the GTA, which means that they are surrounded by Black culture, they are surrounded by Black people. A huge segment of my research was with participants from Durham. And if we know anything about Durham, this is probably the largest growing African Canadian space that we see a lot of Black people moving into. So moving out of the city of Toronto and into what is considered more of the suburbs brings them out to like Eastern Ontario, southern areas of Ontario, which places like Pickering, Ajax, highest growing places. So these are places where they can actually go to school with a number of Black children or children of color, and therefore they're, you know, sort of exposed to their other cultures and the diversity that exists, and then they are sort of, you know, holding on to those notions. So thank you for that. I've never spoken to people who are living, or to Black girls who are living in predominantly white spaces, and that might be very different for those girls.
So in a way, it comes back to the whole minority majority, you know, issue again. Where are you minoritized? Where are the power relations that are being enacted on you? That's, I think, one of the things. But I wanted to talk about this generational thing, because one of the things that was so striking to me is like, and this is where the contextual comes in. What is the kind of racism that's prevalent at a particular historical time, right? And who are the target groups that are there? So there's a beautiful collection by a group of women, and it's a group of women of color, and it's called Triumph and Resilience. And in that, one of the things that's so clear, they had solicited stories from across the country, from women of color, from diverse backgrounds. And they had put that together. And in putting it together, this is Rashmi Luther was one of the authors, editors of it. They were able to show how women who came in the 40s experienced a particular kind of racism. Women who came in the 90s experienced another kind of racism. And so it was in the kind of experiences of racism that really sort of like influenced how their children then grew up. So where they were a really small minority, they were often exoticized, and it was easier for them to assimilate and for the children to be brought up within sort of white society, being relatively assimilated. Where they were in numbers that were larger, and depending on the kind of racism there was, they were rejected and marginalized and then turned inward to form their own communities of survival. So I think this really makes a big thing. And oftentimes, you hear the accusation, well, these kids of color, they're not really mixing in because look, they hang out with themselves. Well, part of hanging out with themselves is precisely that kind of, trying to find, in fact, a way of affirming oneself within that context. But again, it's like which body and where. And I think this becomes really important because when we think about like the COVID crisis, for instance, what's happening right now, how in fact Black communities have been positioned in a particular way to bear the brunt of not having access and being hyper vulnerable to this virus and at risk. Whereas bodies of color, like Asian bodies, for instance, have been seen as carriers of the virus and be excluded in that way. So this is what I mean about the context being so important. And I really want to underscore and thank you, Kisha, for bringing it back to the colonial, because oftentimes when we think about even decolonizing the academy and decolonizing these spaces, we don't think about the hierarchies of power that are there in colonial situations. So where are particular bodies positioned, and when we think about intersectionality, I'm always reminded again of Kimberly Cranshaw's metaphor of the basement, where all of these bodies are piled on top of each other and they're trying to get out of the hatch. And the ones that are closest to the top are standing and putting pressure on the ones below. And that's how the hierarchy operates. So where are these sort of like Black bodies, Asian bodies, Black Muslim bodies, all of these different bodies situated in that hierarchy, in what frame of racism, and where? I think geography makes a big difference, because I think about BC having, lived there and grown up there, and how anti-Asian it still is, and was, compared to like the Black population there, which was such a minority. And think of this in terms of what's happening in Toronto, or how Muslims are dealt with in Quebec. So I think it's like, where are we situated in this hierarchy, and laterally as well, in terms of the terrain of the nation, that makes a big impact on how, even something like adultification gets understood.
Yes, that's so true. It really makes me think of everything that happened last summer, especially when you're talking about different types of racism depending on the era. As we're all very aware of the social unrest that happened last summer as a result of the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd mainly, right? That's when everything really just kind of went insane, both online and in real life. And it was so interesting hearing people's stories talking about, how am I supposed to sit down with my child, right, and tell them, listen, this is how you need to interact with these type of people in power, or don't interact at all, or fill in the blank, right? Parents having to have these hard conversations, and children as young as 6, 7, my nephew asking myself, why are they killing Black people? Like it doesn't make any sense to them. And how a lot of quote unquote allies, right, were posting these Black squares on Instagram, but you see shortly after, there's no concrete action to support that performatism, essentially. How are we supposed to deal with that? And how does that not lead us into our own circles, into those, like you said, Dr. McPherson, those safe spaces for ourselves?
Yes, Josie, thank you for that question. That is actually such an excellent point, because as an educator who like talks to people and sort of looking at different ways of dealing with working with children, I think that this is one of the areas that I would hope white people could understand in reference to adultification, because it's the same protective factors, the same innocent factors, the same things that they want to protect their children from. They should also then look at how it impacts children of color. Because if we're thinking specifically about, no, I think my 6-year-old is too young to learn about racism, when you have 6-year-old boys, for example, being handcuffed to school benches or in the office in Ontario schools. And so if that 6-year-old boy can experience an adult experience, such as being apprehended by police, why is it that your 6-year-old is too young to understand what that actually does? And so I actually think your example, Josie, is perfect for us to sort of think about how people think about their children and what the experiences that their children have versus what other children are supposed to have and what should be afforded to other communities of color. And so it's really, to me, a perfect way for us to sort of you understand what I'm saying? Black children and white children, or children of color, I should say, because this is something that happens across the board. So racism in reference to adultification is something that happens across the board, but it's just a way for us to sort of look at the differences between what we think is appropriate for white children and what we think then is appropriate. And that's where the adultification comes in, because look how quickly it's easy for us to think about the young Black Muslim child, for example, dealing with war in Sudan. That's a 7-year-old that has to try to avoid landmines. But we could never imagine a young white boy having to do that. Like, that would be absurd. It would be like atrocious. It would be the biggest, international injustice that we would have to fight against because of that. And so to me, I think it's really a perfect way for us to really position what it means when we talk about adultification in the lives of children of color versus what it means for you and your family. And I think it's a perfect way for us to sort of illustrate that example.
Thank you. Dr. Jiwani, we have a question coming in from Julia, and she's asking, I wonder if you can speak to situations when children act as translators for their parents.
If I could speak to that, I think that there's two parts to that. Children end up acting as translators for their parents and navigating the dominant system for their parents as well. And this puts them in a position of being, in one sense, a really uncomfortable position of being ambassadors of their cultures. Because now they're in that position where the service provider is looking at them as being, bearing the burden of race, basically being representative of that entire culture. So navigating that is really hard, because the child knows that there are things that are not so good and there are things that are good, right? Just like there is in the dominant society. So that part is really hard. But I think for me, it's the notion of what happens to the power relations after. So if these children are in that position of playing that role of ambassador and playing the role of the advocate, then what happens in terms of the parents' dependence on them, like the layering of the dependencies on them, where they have to bear this burden of responsibility, but at the same time, them having to turn around and parent their parents, or the parents feeling like, wow, I'm losing my power over this kid, who seems to know more than I do. So, I'm going to keep that kid even more tightly, that kind of thing. So it's that portion, that power relation, that I think is really interesting. And I think part of the thing about translating is that child walks in two worlds, as you know, Josie. It's like knowing what the external dominant society requires and then knowing what the inside is like. I mean, think about this. One of the biggest things I remember as a child growing up is looking for we would be looking for places to rent. And being Indian in Vancouver at that time was not a very good thing, South Asian. So you'd go to a place and like you'd phone, and because I had a somewhat English accent, I would get to that point where, okay, yes, it's available. And then you go there, and the moment they see you, it's not available. And you know, the stories you would hear, well, it's the kind of food you guys cook, right? So what are you going to turn around and tell your mom, don't cook Indian food? Because guess what? This is what's one of the factors that's not allowing us to have a place to rent. You know, it puts you in that kind of like really horrible situation where you're bearing the burden of the culture, but also bearing the burden of race outside. So I think that there is that, the ways in which that power, so the family or the parents that feel really powerless, then not only sort of keep that child well within saying, I'm not letting you go out anywhere, you know, because you're going to be contaminated by this culture and you're not going to be our own. And then the child feeling like, I can't stay here. I need to get out there and merge and actually gain an identity that's going to make me, that's going to be affirming in some way. So it's that kind of sort of like, I know sociologists have called this a culture clash, and it's something that I hate. The term, I don't like the term cultural conflict. I tend to think of it as a power conflict. Which world is going to actually supersede the other, right?
Yes, that's so interesting, especially when these children, they grow up and then there's kind of like this internal battle that has been happening for so long, right? There's this backlash of, okay, well, now that I am quote unquote free, I'm going to act however I want to act, whether it's considered childish or not, because you have that space and that freedom now.
I also, if I could just say, I think kind of the danger of that too is the way in which it creates, okay, so I have, just not to get too personal, but I have a 19-year-old daughter. And obviously I spent time in Jamaica growing up, so I'm very connected to my Jamaican culture. You know, even though I wasn't born there, I would tell my mom, I'm more Jamaican than you are, you know, and so this would be something that I would have. But the difficulty that I've had with trying to sort of share the beauty of the culture and the things that I attach myself with, because of course we know that there's things, as you said, Yasmin, there's things that we like and there's things that we don't, right? Like, and there's things that are good and there's things that are bad everywhere. And so, but the difficulty that I've had, and I think it's because of that negative association that we have, or that the countries that we are coming from bears, that the children bear of those countries, because first of all, we're leaving those countries to find another life somewhere else. So there must be something inherently wrong with the culture and with the country in the first place. Second of all, they are forced to then, you know, compete in a way that forces them to let go of or sort of disassociate themselves from specific aspects of the culture in order to, you know, become blended in or sort of assimilate more to a Canadian like culture and sort of background and so forth. And so I think that what it does to children though is a type of violence in a way, in reference to how we think about where we're coming from, why we are in the West, for example, and what are some of the reasons. Like, we don't think about or connect the colonial history, right? Like, even thinking about places like Haiti, for example, how many of us in this room know the history of Haiti? And what it, so when we see the earthquake, we're like, wow, that country is really poor, but there isn't a tracking of history that shows us exactly why that is. So we have generations of people of children that are associated with countries that they don't necessarily know the true history about. And I would say that even as a Canadian, I didn't learn about residential schools until I was in college. You know what I mean? So there's so much missing interpretations of histories that lead to this disassociation of culture and the way in which we associate or understand these cultures that are in this country of Canada, and that how we would understand it. So I think it's really important to talk about that in reference to not just being, you know, them sort of like stepping away from it, but the violence of that disassociation is also because of the fact that we're not very truthful about how we ended up and why the world is the way that it is right now.
And I think,
no, go ahead, Dr.
Sorry, I wanted to bring it back to W.E.B. Du Bois' notion of the double consciousness, because I think this is if you're talking about the violence of this, it's the violence of the othering. It's the violence of racism, right? And that's basically what's splitting. So in the whole sort of like the notion of like the historical erasures that are there around like how we ended up being where we are, or what were the sort of like what is the complicity of the West in creating the conditions that move us, that propel us, right, outside the areas that we were born in. I think this is really fundamental to not only sort of understanding the overall violence that has sort of like created the conditions under which we live, but also the internalizing of it. And this double consciousness of how we're viewed from the outside, how we see ourselves on the inside, you know, I think is something that again, you know, I don't like to think of everything as a liability. I think there is an asset to it because it makes us see things very differently. But it does have an effect on the soul.
Right. And my question is, who would you say is responsible for kind of filling those gaps of history and what has not usually been told and what has been often misunderstood? Does the onus fall on the individual, or we've mentioned systems a lot? Is it possible for the system to be responsible for that?
So I'm going to say the educator in me, the educator scholar in me says that it's the responsibility of the systems that benefit from our labor, that benefit from our human infrastructure, that are creating spaces where people are coming to do the jobs and the works that make society run. I would think that it's those systems' responsibility to ensure that those people who they've invited in are accommodated for, fully supported, and is able to live as full human beings. And so the education system from the beginning, because I think that we can accomplish a lot with education in terms of providing truthful information. I love Bob Marley, not because I'm Jamaican. I won't let you stereotype me just because it's good music. He has this line in one of the songs that he sings, it's called Babylon System. He says, teach the children the truth. I think a lot of times white supremacy works in a way that we have to lie, we have to uncover things, because if we tell the truth, then it's another reckoning that we're forced with. But then the activist side of me, which is not fully formed, I'll be honest about that, says that it's also our responsibility. So leaving that in the hands of government in terms of our education, which leads to our ultimate survival, is really a mistake for us if we're thinking that, you know, these governments are going to be able to take care of us. But yes, as a scholar, educator, somebody that's committed to, you know, systemic change, I would definitely say these systems are responsible of it. But as the, you know, sort of activist parent, let's just say as a mother, I think that it's also the responsibility of us individually to ensure that our children are equipped to deal with the spaces that we are raising them in.
Dr. Jiwani, do you agree?
Yes, I totally agree. And I'm thinking of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you know, in the same way. But I'm also sort of really reminded, this is the cynic in me, when we have people like Legault who deny systemic racism, you know, and we had Harper before who basically claimed that Canada was not colonized. If that is the level at which our leaders, our political leaders are thinking, right? And the trickle down effect of that, like when you think about the rise of the far right here and its strength and power, that a particular kind of mythology of this country operates, which is really, really strong. It's like, you know, we are benevolent. Look, we've taken you in. Be grateful, right? You always have to be the grateful immigrant or the refugee. You cannot be otherwise. And so, you know, it's that kind of sort of largesse, right? The idea that we've done this for you and we were never like that and we are so innocent. So I think, you know, uncovering that or dismantling that is like a huge challenge. And had it not been, I think, for advocacy and activists on the ground, I don't even think it would have happened to the extent that it has. But there's such the violence of erasure is continuing, because you think about the recommendations of that. I'm thinking about the recommendations, in fact, just recently, of the motion 103 that Ikra Khalid put out in order to recognize Islamophobia. How only one recommendation was implemented, and that was recognizing January 29th. But even there, like, you know, you think about like how, I mean, the process, she had over what, 5,000 or 50,000 hate messages sent to her for introducing this motion. Like how, in fact, the resistance that's there is so, so strong. And yet it's the advocacy of groups that made it possible for that violence of erasure to be sort of pushed back in a way to have January 29th. So at each point, we have to struggle along the way without resources, without support, except for alliances, you know, and which become really, really critical. So how then do you push that continually? And I think this is where systems that are in the interest of equity, because that is such a big thing right now, and quote, diversity. I really like something that I tweeted that a student of mine brought to my attention, because there's no such thing as a diverse person. But the language of diversity that's used, that's to push that agenda, bearing in mind that that push has to be equitable, because the system is structured hierarchically, always in intersectionality, privileging some, punishing others, right? And sort of like, you know, creating a system where people are positioned so that they benefit actually from the oppression of others. I think that kind of honesty is what we need to bring out. And of course, getting rid of political elites who obviously have no sense of history.
I think, Yasmin, you also forgot Doug Ford recently in your list there of the political figures who just recently last year stated that there's no anti-Black racism in Ontario. And so that's laughable, right? Because it's like exactly what you're saying. If we are looking at these political figures that we're electing into power with these types of thoughts, notions, ideologies, or understanding of the world, we're doomed if that's who we're depending on in order to create systems that are more fair and equitable. So there is a personal, you know, advocacy and responsibility of those groups that are working on the ground to push these changes forward.
Absolutely. It's a bit of both for sure. There's a question and a comment from Kim coming in. She would like to thank you for so clearly articulating how racism and sexism needs to be unraveled within specific contexts at specific historical moments and related to complex and shifting relations of power tied to a multiplicity of state regulations and policies. But her question, she says, I wonder how the issue of adultification in relationship to racism makes us have to consider what age studies have considered as ageist. Would y'all like to speak on that?
What age studies has considered as ageist. I think part of the thing is like, if you have, and I'm just going to sort of like speculate on this. When you think about it, if you have a situation where the child is being adultified, that child growing up then into an adult, taking on increasingly more and more caretaking roles, and that becomes their identity basically, to the point where they have no other life except for that. That's how they're defined. So what happens then when that identity is gone? What happens if the structures of power that uphold that identity, it's like the breadwinner who suddenly has no role anymore because of being unemployed, but has the responsibilities and has been socialized into that caregiving role. I think part of it is that, but the other part of where it factors into age studies is the dependency. So when there's a heightened dependency of older people, it's like they get stereotyped in a particular way, and they're seen as limited and lacking in the resources, or lacking in cultural capital to be able to do anything, right? And I think this is where ageism comes in, because it's like it foists a stereotype on these people as being less than, less able to, right? Without looking at what is there in their environment that's contributing to that. And how can systems and structures and policies and practices intercede in that process? that's just a go at it, Kim.
Dr. McPherson, do you have anything to add?
No, well, I was just thinking about it in reference to thinking about, okay, so one of the things that as a sort of newer scholar, like somebody who just sort of, you know, enters into these worlds, I think that some of these fields need to be expanded. So a lot of times when we think, because I had trouble with this when I was sort of pulling my study together, focusing on Black girls and thinking about intersectionality, it was, you know, one of my supervisors said to me, well, what about ageism? And I was like, well, do we think about ageism in relation to children? And whether or not that sort of is how the construction of the field is meant to sort of focus on or to look at it. So a lot of times what we've expanded and what we've had to, and especially when we're thinking about people of color trying to fit themselves into scholarship, we've recognized that a number of these fields need to be more expansive in reference to how some of these concepts are understood and how the field takes it up. So I was having this same sort of tension when I was thinking about ability and ableism, because I was saying adultification is also, you know, we could also point to ableism as one of those areas. But then I was thinking, okay, but ableism is often how we think about, you know, putting, you know, dis into the brackets, right? Because we're thinking about disability. But then now we also have to take into consideration hyperability. So when we're thinking about it in reference to children, it's not the disability, but you are, you know, creating a hyper sense of what these children are supposed to be able to do and what is developmentally appropriate in reference to how you treat them. And so it's not the dis, but it's now sort of creating this excessive way in which we think that children, for example, are supposed to have the ability to, you know, make the grocery list, do the groceries, come home, pack it out, cook the food, all of these things for a 10-year-old girl, let's just say. And so that creates that that distinction between that dis and hyper. Ability is still part of the field that I would like to sort of position this in. But again, thinking about scholarly fields, it's always really touchy in terms of what's included. And you'll always have scholars that will say, no, that doesn't fit here, or that's not what you're talking about. So there's always that, you know, tension that comes in. And I feel as a Black woman, it's been so difficult for me to try to, you know, even working with Black girls, I'm thinking, oh, is it girl studies? But no, girl studies is white. Is it youth studies? No, youth studies is male. Is it, you know, is it Black women? Like I use a Black feminist epistemological approach, but at the same time, they're not women, they're children. And so it's just definitely finding areas within these fields that you could then describe a phenomenon that might not necessarily be taken up as part of that field on a regular basis.
I just want to add something to that, if I may. You know, it just brings me to the whole notion of how constructed these categories are, right? So I'm thinking about Philip Ares's work on the construction of childhood, the idea of children as innocent and so forth. And if we think about age as so constructed, like this is childhood, this is adulthood, this is sort of young adulthood, this is senior, like all of the trappings that are there, right, which are undergirded not only by the stereotypes and the lore, the cultural lore, but also by the policies, practices, legislation that's there, right? Like, for instance, a child has to go to school by a certain age, right? If that child doesn't go to school, that child becomes a deviant. So the idea that at a certain point, like if you've got white hair, you're a senior. And if you're a senior, this is what's required of you. And the trappings that go around that, right? So it's the construction. And again, I come back to the whole notion of in whose interests are these constructions operating? So when I go back to childhood, for instance, the construction of childhood, and I think back to those historical studies, you know, there was a time when children were considered young adults, and oftentimes they were brought in and beaten, or something traumatic was done to them when they were there as witnesses to a contract. So the idea was that that painful trauma would make them remember the contract to the time when they were they were in their senior years. So what happened then in the construction of childhood as this kind of vulnerable, dependent category? And I think, of course, the whole sort of like the psychology of education, developmental psychology, all of those sort of systems of knowledge came in. But a big, big part of it was also consumer culture. the need to create a sizable portion of the population that had disposable income. You know, income that wasn't tied to paying mortgages, that wasn't tied to anything else, that was absolutely this. So going from the 50s, 1950s in the West, this kind of like the idea of consumer culture then creating this category, children and young adults, and the marketing that was there. So this is, you know, it makes you really wonder then, like there's so many categories that we take for granted, but how much of them are social constructions that have operated in the interests of power?
And also how those social constructions are inherently racist. Because when you think about what you were just describing, it just came into my mind. The Industrial Revolution was started with a whole bunch of factories with young children. They were all child labor, like 10-year-olds that were going in. That was a part of the factory line. But then as you mentioned there, it becomes a problem, or becomes something that we then shift in terms of capitalism, and how much now we need to create another category that we can now market to, and how that market, and then so this idea of like even what you described as like children being their parents' peers sort of plays into this whole capitalist idea of promoting things and selling things to children, because ultimately they will have the power to convince their parents. They call it like bragging power or something like that in a marketing context. But then what I'm getting at is that it's always an issue of racism when we start to shift and change these notions and these associations with these constructions in a way that serves the capitalist interest and then continues to marginalize people of color. And so we have to be careful about that. We could also even have that conversation around the legalization of marijuana. This used to be a big drug that was, of course, again, placed into those narratives and trappings in reference to people of color and in communities of color. And now that it's something that's seen as profitable and capitalism has gotten its hands on it, it's now something that is normalized within our society as a regular form of activity. Whereas there's a whole bunch of Black and brown people that have been sitting in jail for many decades for small minor drug infractions that they now have to find ways to like change systems in order to. So, you know, just sort of speaking on what Yasmin is sort of mentioning here is the shifts in our society. We change these constructions in a way that supports capitalist interests, and then it becomes what we have, and that's how we can identify adultification bias, for example, as something that is so deeply tied to racism, sexism, and all of these other constructions.
What would you say is the reason so many young children of color kind of grow up and continue to perpetuate these realities in their own homes? Is it lack of education, lack of healing? So you'll have like a young girl who'll grow up, and as she's growing up and being put all of these pressures and burdens, you know, she hates it, right? Realizes that, or the majority will hate it. Some will assume the responsibility and just say it is the way it is, but there'll be a lot who will not necessarily enjoy it. But yet when they grow up and they become parents, right, it kind of continues. The system or the tradition continues of like, okay, well, you know, you're supposed to do this now. And we find ourselves in the same kind of like vicious circle or cycle. Is it because they are not aware of what they're doing, or it hasn't, you know, they haven't decided to tackle that in a safe space, maybe with a therapist, or the fact that recently this notion wasn't even, it didn't really have a name, at least here in Canada, right? And so is it just a lack of understanding, a lack of education?
I'm laughing at that point because I think of me as a mother of a 19-year-old and how, you know, you try to not be your mother. I'm not going to be my mom, but then you end up being your mom. And that's really one of the ways that I sort of think about that question, like in reference to how we take on and we carry on some of that trauma that is embedded in how we raise our children, right? Like in terms of, you know, this conversation comes up all the time with corporal punishment and whether or not, children are supposed to be spanked. And some cultures will say this is what we do to raise the children, and then in a Western society, it is absolutely not heard of. And therefore, if you do that, you will get your children taken away from you, and you're living in a system that you now must abide by this sort of structural norm and rule that is not something that you were associated with while you were being raised, and how you were taught to raise children, right? Because we also have to think about a lot of what we engage in are forms of pedagogy that teaches us and informs how we will then go about and do the things that we're supposed to do. And so I think about myself in that respect. And again, like, not trying to get too personal, but it isn't until later in my life that I had more appreciation for my mother, and realizing how racism and sexism kept me from that appreciation for so long, because I wasn't able to fully understand how these things were being enacted within this parent-child relationship. But then when you're able, but it doesn't happen until later. So, I give my 19-year-old a break, because I'll say, okay, I'll give her another 10 years, and then she'll recognize how I'm the best mother in the entire universe. Because it comes later, when the reckoning and the sort of understanding of these systems, these inherently racist and structural systems that we're forced to live in, then sort of, changes the way we deal with and think about it. But I do think it's some unlearning of some of those trauma, the good stuff that we want to keep, and then the bad stuff that we want to let go. It's sort of deciphering what that is and figuring out, and as you said, Josie, like, creating safer spaces where we can then talk that out, and having, without the gaze of the systems of power that's telling us that it shouldn't be that way. And I think that that's the biggest thing for immigrant families and, people of color, is that we want to evolve and to change in ways that are suitable for us, and not necessarily, informed by these boxes that we are placed in when we live here or we move here.
Dr. Jiwani, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with everything Kisha said. I think it's great. I can't add any more to it. Really, it was really wonderful. And I think part of the thing is, like, in perpetuating it is also, when you have become adultified like that, where you are almost like a parent to your own parents, you carry that caregiver role. You become that. And so when you are having your own children, I think you do the same thing. It's like it perpetuates itself like that. Your identity almost becomes like that of a caregiver.
And isn't it interesting how we, like, then judge that, like, when we judge that as something as positive? Like, I'm always struck, and like how our systems will remind us of the oppressive ways in which we've normalized particular types of actions. Like, I think about George Bush, for example, after 9/11, telling everyone to go and shop, right? Like, it's just, this is what you need to do to build the economy. Just go out and buy things and stuff like that. So the things that we encourage and that we hold up as something that's valuable becomes the 19-year-old that is super responsible and mature and is able to, like, pay her bills and buy a house at 21. All of the things that we associate with adult like behavior is things that we tell them that they should be doing. But then other communities get to be chilled. No, you're 19, go travel the world, take a backpack through Europe, right? Whereas in, for children of color, we're supposed to then stack up all of these things in our resume and in what we own and have in order to then compete and be viable within the society. It is actually, when we start to look at the differences here and we start to compare them, like, this is why I always say, why can't we just be real with what exactly is happening as a way to theorize this stuff, rather than coming up with complex language and stuff like that? We could just show you the differences within these communities, and it'll be clear as to how racism then impacts the adultification bias for children of color.
And that's so unfortunate. Like, this does intersect with so many things, especially the economic aspect, but you'll do all of these things, right, as children of color, and you'll still fall short because the system was never made for us, right? And it's like, how do you deal with that? How do you navigate that once you come of age and you're like, okay, well, what was all that for?
I think the only way to deal with any of this, any kind of violence, is through alliances. It's through solidarity. And it's creating communities. I cannot see any other way of surviving a system that is so violent. You know, uh, I I chalk my own survival to the work that others have done before me that created this pathway. You know, um, and to the support that I get even now to the work that I'm doing. It's literally. I mean, I remember as a graduate student, and I've told this to other graduate students too. I survived graduate school because of the activism outside. That was like living in a sane world and bringing that sanity back into the insane world of academia. That was the only way I survived. And to have that truth, which was so often dismissed at the time, being resonated and affirmed as true outside. You know, I've always said about Canadian racism is really like, it's a discourse of denial, right? So basically it's like, you say something and it's denied. It's like, oh, we're not like that. We're really, it's the problem is you, which makes you go crazy. But doing the activism outside was seeing all these people who are feeling the same way and who are experiencing similar things and saying, wow, I'm not mad, I'm not insane. This really is a reality for us. And I think it's that that keeps us alive. And I think, you know, opportunities like this where we get to talk about, you know, these kinds of similarities of experiences and affirming truths are actually the nuggets that keep us going. Being
That's so
sane in
true.
an insane world.
That's so true. It's kind of similar to what Dr. Toni Morrison had said, where it's like the narrative of racism. It's a distraction because we're in it and we realize that this is a reality that we're living. And to constantly have to say that it exists to people who constantly want to deny it is a distraction to the actual work that needs to be happening, right? Dr. McPherson, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say too, but it goes to what we were discussing, what Yasmin discussed earlier too, in terms of the imagination that we live in. And so when we have our leaders that imagine this sense of Canada that is free of all of these things, we then become, and so that continued defense of ourselves, or like trying to explain the phenomenons and how they happen and what they look like, becomes this really difficult task because I'm taking you out of the imagination. Like, I think of it like a dream. Imagine a dream that you're in and you're, you know, superior and everything is, you know, your children are like well and everything is great. Like, who wants to wake up from that? Who wants to create or sort of enter in, or who wants to be faced with the fact that that is actually a dream? It's a dream that you're living in that disproportionately affects and impacts groups of people who don't have access there. Like, it's just what it's a phenomenon that you're experiencing in your life because of the power and the privilege that has been, you know, afforded to people who look like you, but it's really not the reality for 85% of the rest of the world. And I say that percentage as that large too, because, you know, poor white people are also not, they don't have access to this sort of middle class white life that has free children, able to engage in childhood, that allows us to sort of ignore issues of racism, sexism, classism, and stuff like that. I think poor white folks are also dealing with the difficulty of this imagination that some members of our communities are actually living and trying to maintain. And that's the reason why it's so difficult for us to then explain away these things, because we're actually forcing people to wake up from a very beautiful dream that they're having for their lives.
That is so well put, and so true. As we come to the closing of this conversation, I just want to leave space for anyone else who has a question. Oh, one just came in. So we'll be taking the last few questions trickling in, and then we're just going to wrap up. So we have a question from Kim, or more of a comment, where she says it also goes back to what was discussed as quote unquote benevolent racism that doesn't recognize how it makes discussion of the racism that exists impossible to bring to public attention, like quote unquote repressive tolerance. Yes, thank you, Kim. I saw both speakers nodding their heads in agreement. And I believe that's true. I just want to take this time to just affirm both of you and the work that you have done and are doing and will continue to do. It's so necessary. This conversation and conversations like these are so necessary. One, to inform and educate, right? Those who come to listen to it. Two, to allow us to have these spaces, right? To be able to speak about our own experiences and to remind us that we are not crazy, we're not insane, this is necessary, and this is valid. And then everything that you are saying is valid and so important. So thank you so much for coming on, for sharing and for speaking. I would like to leave the floor to you too, if you have any final words that you want to say before passing it on to Tristana.
I would just like to say thank you for the invitation and thank you for allowing us. And Yasmin, this conversation has been great. I'm looking forward to maybe even talking to you again in terms of seeing how our work continues to their synergies.
I'd love it, yeah.
And so thank you so much to Concordia and the partners for the panel for just making the space for us to have this conversation that's so important. And I was writing all these notes down because so many different ideas came to my mind as we were talking through some of these things. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Kisha, so much. I really, really enjoyed this panel. I didn't expect it to go on for as long as it did, but it just goes to show that when you're having a good conversation, time just disappears. So, and Josie, thank you so much for moderating, and your own experiences. Really, I very much appreciated that. Tristan, I can't say anything more. Thank you.
Josie, I'll take the floor. Thanks. I also, there's so many thanks. I'll start off by saying thanks to Josie for her excellent job moderating this panel, for handling the questions, and for carrying forward the conversation between the panelists. So thank you so much for agreeing. I also want to thank the panelists for just your experts work, your ability to just illuminate this phenomenon so complexly. And just thank you for accepting the invitation to speak on this issue and for giving us this opportunity to learn from you. I'll turn to the audience in the virtual world who are there. I wanted to thank all of you for posing your questions in the chat box and in the question and answer period. Thank you for joining us and for participating in today's conversation. We hope one day it will be, face-to-face again. And I also want to again thank the Black Perspectives Office for supporting this event. If you are interested in sort of continuing this conversation, so looking at the question, the interactions, the intersections between race and age, we are hosting, Engage with the Black Perspectives Office, hosting another event called Black Aging in Canada. That event, rather than looking at age and race in early life, we'll be looking at its intersections in later life, and that is taking place on February 18th from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you're just generally interested in staying in touch with Engage and the events and activities that happen in and through the center, I invite you to follow us on Twitter or to join our newsletter. And with that, thank you again to each of the panelists and to the moderator, Josie, and take good care.